There exists within the structure of the human psyche a contradiction so deeply buried that most individuals spend their entire lives avoiding it. It is not the contradiction between good and evil, nor between truth and illusion, but something far more intimate and unsettling: the recognition that the force we most fear in others, the force we condemn as betrayal, exists not as an external anomaly, but as an internal potential. The figure of Judas, so often reduced to a moral caricature, is in fact a profound psychological symbol. He is not merely the betrayer of another, but the embodiment of the capacity within the human soul to abandon truth at the precise moment it becomes most inconvenient to uphold it. In the alchemical tradition, transformation does not begin with harmony. It begins with rupture. The prima materia, the raw substance of the work, is not pure. It is chaotic, contradictory, unrefined. It contains within it both the potential for gold and the inevitability of decay. The process of transformation requires that this material be subjected to fire, to dissolution, to a state in which its former structure can no longer hold. This stage, known as Nigredo, is not symbolic in the superficial sense. It is experiential. It is the collapse of the narrative through which the individual has understood both themselves and the world. Betrayal functions as one of the most direct catalysts of this collapse. It is not merely painful because of the act itself, but because of what it reveals. It reveals that the image we constructed of another person, of a relationship, of our own discernment was incomplete. The psyche resists this recognition because it destabilizes identity. To accept betrayal as real is to accept that one's perception was flawed, that one's certainty was misplaced, that one's control was illusory. And so the immediate reaction is projection. The other becomes the sole bearer of guilt. They are labeled, condemned, and expelled from the internal narrative of coherence. But projection is only the first layer. If one remains within it, no transformation occurs. The alchemical fire is extinguished before it can complete its work. For beneath the projection lies a more dangerous realization that the capacity for betrayal is not confined to the external other. It exists within the structure of one's own psyche, not necessarily in identical form, not necessarily expressed in identical action, but present nonetheless as potential. This is the function of the inner Judas. He is the voice that negotiates with truth, the part of the psyche that calculates advantage, that prioritizes comfort over integrity, that chooses silence when speech would disrupt stability. He does not appear as a villain in subjective experience. He appears as justification, as rationalization, as the quiet suggestion that compromise is necessary, that timing is not right, that preservation of the current structure is more important than alignment with what is known internally to be true. In this sense, betrayal is not an isolated event. It is a pattern of micro-decisions, each one a slight deviation from alignment, accumulating until the structure of trust collapses. When one is betrayed by another, one confronts the external manifestation of this pattern. When one reflects deeply enough, one recognizes the internal version of the same mechanism. Jungian psychology articulates this through the concept of the shadow. The shadow is not merely the repository of socially unacceptable traits. It is the totality of what has been excluded from conscious identity. It includes not only aggression, envy, and selfishness, but also weakness, fear, and the desire for security at the expense of truth. The shadow is not evil. It is incomplete. And because it is unrecognized, it operates autonomously. The encounter with betrayal often marks the moment at which the shadow becomes visible. Not because it suddenly appears, but because the conditions of the psyche no longer allow it to remain hidden. The persona, the constructed identity that maintained coherence, cracks under pressure. and through that fracture, material emerges that cannot be easily categorized or dismissed. The individual is then faced with a choice: to reconstitute the persona as quickly as possible, to restore a sense of stability by reinforcing familiar narratives, or to remain within the disorientation long enough for a deeper restructuring to occur. The former leads to repetition. The latter leads to transformation. To remain within the disorientation is to enter fully into Nigredo. It is to allow the collapse of previous certainty without rushing to replace it. It is to observe the movement of the psyche without immediate interpretation. This is not passivity. It is disciplined containment. The alchemists insisted upon the necessity of the sealed vessel precisely for this reason. If the process is interrupted, if the contents are exposed prematurely, the volatile elements escape, and the transformation remains incomplete. Within this containment, the figure of the inner Judas becomes increasingly clear. One begins to notice the subtle ways in which one has participated in one's own fragmentation, not as an act of self-condemnation, but as an act of recognition. One sees where intuition was ignored, where boundaries were compromised, where truth was subordinated to comfort. This recognition is destabilizing because it undermines the binary structure of victim and perpetrator. It introduces complexity where the psyche prefers simplicity. But it is precisely this complexity that allows integration. To integrate the inner Judas is not to justify betrayal, but to understand its conditions. To see how fear, desire, and insecurity interact to produce deviation from alignment. To recognize that without awareness, these conditions will continue to operate, regardless of intention. The individual who has not confronted their own capacity for betrayal remains vulnerable not only to being betrayed, but to betraying themselves repeatedly in less obvious ways. The alchemy of pain lies in this recognition. Pain, when resisted, remains chaotic. It produces reaction, avoidance, and repetition. Pain, when contained and observed, becomes structured. It reveals patterns. It exposes mechanisms. It transforms from an overwhelming force into a source of information. This transformation is not immediate. It requires time, repetition, and what the alchemists referred to as philosophical patience. The willingness to endure discomfort without premature resolution. The willingness to remain within contradiction until a higher order of coherence emerges. From this process, something begins to take shape. Not the restoration of the previous identity, but the emergence of a more integrated structure. One that includes awareness of shadow. One that does not rely on illusion for stability. One that can hold contradiction without collapse. This is what is symbolically referred to as the birth of the self, not as a mystical abstraction, but as a functional reorganization of the psyche. The ego remains, but its position changes. It is no longer the center. It becomes a mediator between conscious and unconscious processes. It gains flexibility, resilience, and depth. Betrayal, in this context, is not redeemed in the moral sense. It is not justified. It remains painful, but its function becomes clear. It serves as the force that disrupts stagnation, that exposes illusion, that initiates descent. Without this descent, ascent remains superficial. The figure of Judas, then, is not to be dismissed as purely negative. He is to be understood as a symbol of the necessary confrontation with the part of the psyche that negotiates truth. To deny him is to remain incomplete. To integrate him is to reduce his unconscious influence. There is, however, an additional dimension to this process that is often overlooked, even in sophisticated psychological discourse. The confrontation with betrayal does not merely expose the presence of the shadow. It alters the individual's relationship to truth itself. Prior to this confrontation, truth is often experienced as something stable, something that can be possessed, articulated, and defended. One believes that if one understands correctly, if one perceives clearly, then one can orient oneself within reality with a degree of certainty. Betrayal dissolves this assumption. It reveals that perception is not neutral. It is conditioned, structured by desire, by fear, by prior identification. What one took to be clarity was, in many cases, coherence, a story that held together well enough to avoid contradiction. The psyche prefers coherence over accuracy because coherence provides stability. Accuracy, when it disrupts coherence, produces anxiety. The inner Judas operates precisely at this threshold. He does not necessarily distort reality in an obvious way. He maintains coherence. He edits perception just enough to preserve the existing structure of identity. He allows certain facts to remain visible while rendering others peripheral or irrelevant. In this way, betrayal is not always an abrupt act. It is often the culmination of a long sequence of subtle omissions, moments in which truth was partially seen but not fully acknowledged. When betrayal occurs externally, it forces a sudden expansion of perception. What was previously excluded can no longer be ignored. The psyche is compelled to integrate information that contradicts its prior narrative. This integration is painful not only because of the emotional content, but because it requires a reorganization of the cognitive structure itself. The individual must now hold two realities simultaneously: what was believed and what is revealed. This is a form of psychological tension that cannot be resolved through simple adjustment. It requires a restructuring at a deeper level. The alchemists describe this as the tension of opposites, the simultaneous presence of contradiction within the vessel. If this tension is endured rather than prematurely resolved, it generates transformation. If it is avoided, the psyche collapses back into one-sidedness. This is why the impulse to simplify after betrayal is so strong. One wants to reduce complexity, to assign clear roles, to restore a sense of moral order. But genuine transformation resists simplification. It demands that the individual tolerate ambiguity, that they remain within the unresolved tension long enough for a new form of understanding to emerge. Within this tension, the inner Judas becomes less of a figure and more of a function. One begins to see how the psyche organizes itself around preservation, how it negotiates truth in order to maintain continuity. This recognition is not comfortable. It undermines the idea of oneself as consistently aligned, as fundamentally honest, as immune to distortion. But it also introduces the possibility of a different kind of integrity. Not the integrity of never deviating, but the integrity of recognizing deviation when it occurs, of observing the movement of avoidance in real time, of interrupting the pattern before it consolidates into action. This shift marks the transition from unconscious participation to conscious engagement. It is subtle. It does not announce itself dramatically, but it changes the structure of experience. The individual becomes less certain but more precise, less rigid but more aware. They no longer rely on fixed narratives to orient themselves. They rely on observation. And observation, sustained over time, refines perception. As perception refines, the need for projection diminishes. One sees more of what is present, both externally and internally. The boundary between self and other becomes less defined by opposition and more by differentiation. One can acknowledge the wrongdoing of another without collapsing into identification or denial. One can acknowledge one's own complicity without dissolving into shame. This is the beginning of integration. not the elimination of contradiction, but the capacity to hold it without fragmentation. And it is within this capacity that the deeper function of betrayal becomes visible. It is not merely an event that disrupts. It is a force that reorganizes. It compels the psyche to evolve beyond the limitations of its previous structure, but only if it is allowed to complete its work. The chamber of the heart does not open through comfort. It opens through pressure, through rupture, through the failure of the structures that once maintained coherence. And what emerges through that opening is not purity, but clarity. The clarity to see oneself without distortion. The clarity to act with greater alignment. The clarity to recognize that transformation is not a movement away from darkness, but a movement through it. The alchemical work is not concerned with avoiding betrayal. It is concerned with understanding what betrayal reveals. And what it reveals, if one is willing to see it, is the architecture of the self itself.